Starting tomorrow morning, if the organizers are correct, hundreds of people, demonstrators, will gather on Parliament Hill opposing the XL Pipeline. Well, we're joined now by one of the men who organizes that group, Clayton Thomas Mueller, an environmentalist, also by David Coles, who represents workers in the oil business in northern Alberta, particularly in the heavy oil business, and by Alykhan Velshi, who is the organizer, which many of you already have heard of, Ethical Oil. Let me go to you first, Mr. Thomas Mueller. There are all kinds of pipelines. I've lost track of how many across the United States from Alberta. What's the matter with this one?
Well, if the Keystone XL is approved in November by Secretary of State Clinton, it will result in a dramatic increase of 30% of extraction in the tar sands region, which carries with it a social and economic and human rights costs, especially for local First Nations, who have been suffering disproportionately from extremely high cancer rates, who have seen their water systems, their air quality, the quality of the animals that they live on in the land destroyed by the tar sands industry. And so, you know, we are adamantly opposing the Keystone XL pipeline because of the critical human rights situation that's playing out in First Nations communities in northern Alberta.
Mr. Coles, I think a lot of people are going to be puzzled at why a union leader is here opposing the construction of a pipeline.
Well, this is the fifth year of our opposition. We've gone from appealing it right at the National Energy Board right up to the courts, and it's because it kills jobs, it's not good for the economy, and it's certainly detrimental to the environment. So you can't delink them. We think it's a critical mistake, and we're diametrically opposed to exporting raw bitumen out of Alberta.
Mr. Velshi, I'm going to come to you for a moment, but first I want to show a clip of the controversial video you put out about ethical oil. Let's see that.
We bankrolled a state that doesn't allow women to drive, doesn't allow them to leave their homes or work without their male guardian's permission, and a state where a woman's testimony only counts for a half of a man's.
Okay. What's your answer to the criticisms these men are making, and why ethical oil? I mean, that sounds like it's the best argument you could come up with. It sounds like a bit of an admission of defeat.
Not at all. I think the first point that I'd have to make is that when it comes to petroleum energy, people, businesses, and governments have a choice to make, and that choice is between ethical oil from places like Canada and its oil sands, or conflict oil from politically oppressive regimes like Saudi Arabia. In terms of the specific arguments that we've heard, not all unions are opposed to Keystone XL, quite the opposite. In fact, the union that represents journeymen and apprentices in the pipe fitting and plumbing industry has supported this because it's going to create tens of thousands of jobs directly on both sides of the border. And in terms of Aboriginals, the oil and gas sector is the largest employer of Aboriginals in the country, and there are bands in Alberta, like the Fort McKay band, that precisely because of the oil sands have close to 0% unemployment. So this is a win for Canadians, this is a win for workers, it's a win for Aboriginals, and it's a win for our bilateral relationship. So for me, Keystone XL seems like a no-brainer, especially because it's going to wean us off our dependence on conflict oil.
So to both of you, it sounds like there's no unity among the opposition.
Well, I think that those claims are absolutely ludicrous. You know, bottom line, Canada imports oil from OPEC. You know, if the Keystone XL is built, I mean, you know, the government that my colleague here has been attacking, the Saudis, will stand to benefit economically from it as well because they own one of the refineries down in Port Arthur, Texas. You know, I mean, the reality of it is that Indigenous peoples in northern Alberta, you know, have been locked into a situation where they have to choose between their fundamental human rights, protecting their way of life, protecting their relationship to the sacredness of Mother Earth, or working for the oil sands sector. What we are advocating for is bottom line. We have to end, you know, our dependency on a fossil fuel regime. We have to invest in new technologies and create local green jobs for First Nations and for workers that are working in the oil sector.
I would ask the Prime Minister and my dear friend and anyone involved with that silly term ethical oil just to cut it out. I mean, the XL pipeline is unethical because it is going to sell oil to the state-owned refinery in Port Arthur, Texas. It doesn't make any sense to use that shallow argument when in fact Canada has agreements, trade agreements with the Saudi regime. So you can't sort of suck and blow at the same time. These are issues that should be debated in the House of Commons, not use spin as a reason why it should go ahead.
You know, Craig, oil is like any other commodity. It's like coffee, or it's like chicken. And just like when we buy coffee, we want to buy fair trade coffee. Just like when we buy chickens, we want to buy free range chicken, not factory farm chickens. When we buy oil, I think our preference should be to buy, as I call it, ethical oil from places like Canada, which respect the rights of women, respect the rights of gays and lesbians, as opposed to conflict oil. And that's really what the choice is.
And
we want to expand the supply of Canadian oil.
Funding to the Sisters in Spirit Fund, who was trying to identify the 600 murdered and missing Aboriginal women in this country.
Well, that has absolutely nothing to do with Keystone XL.
I hardly think that Canada is in a position to say that it respects the rights of women when the Harper government has done nothing but cut off funding to women's advocacy organizations in this country.
I think if you compare the treatment and the rights of Aboriginals in Canada, which are protected by the Charter, with those of Indigenous peoples in, for example, Sudan and the Darfur region, I think Canada stacks up quite well compared to conflict
Aboriginal women
regime.
in this country. I don't think we should get into a situation where we're comparing one life to another
Canada
life.
is no better than Sudan or Saudi Arabia, then I think that's a ridiculous argument. That's a ridiculous
that's
argument, and it's obscene.
You know, it's really
don't spin it. Don't spin it. You're going to sell oil to the refinery that's owned by the state of Saudi Arabia, and that's.
Speaking of spin, you know, last week you were making your arguments, and you referred to this as ethical oil ad, which Craig just showed, and you said it had racist overtones. So my question is this: first of all, I think it's absurd on its face to say that an ad that I designed has racist overtones with respect to other visible minorities. So I want to know, first of all, are you willing to repeat that argument now that you're seated a foot away from me, and are you willing to justify it and say what is racist about criticizing the treatment of women in Saudi Arabia?
That's not what I said.
You used the word racist overtones. That's exactly what you said.
That's exactly what I said. The question that I asked in the context was, how can the Canadian government sell oil to Saudi Arabia and then say that it is ethical oil?
You said the ad had racist overtones, but I'm glad that you're not willing to repeat it now that you're sitting next to me.
Let's talk about spin here. I mean, the reality of it is the tar sands industry here in Canada is ground zero for the technology as well. There are a dozen countries across the planet, many in the global south, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, like Madagascar and other places, that are looking to the private sector oil sands industry here in Canada for their technology. You know, and the bottom line is what the Keystone XL Pipeline represents is the hard wiring in of outdated technology, outdated energy source for the next 50 years in the world's biggest energy market in the United States. And we have to stop that. We have the technology to move to a zero carbon economy. You look at Germany. Germany's got 250,000 workers employed in the renewable energy sector, 20% of the total country's energy on renewable energy just this year alone. The technology's there. We should not be continuing on with dirty oil.
Mr. Coles, I'm going to give you the final word here because I want to say, are you fighting a losing battle here? The State Department isn't going to be talking about environmentalism. They're going to be talking about national interest. The State Department apparently has already said they find no reason why this shouldn't be built. So doesn't she have a bias, and isn't she probably going to support this thing?
Well, they have another problem in Canada, is the permit is expired for XL. There has been no construction. It was committed. It had to be done by March. Okay. The Harper government has the right now, I think, to do the right thing, and that is to review this, put it in the House of Commons, put it before the Resource Committee, and let's have a big public debate on whether this is good for Canada or not.
Gentlemen, thank you for coming in. We've got to wrap it up. I appreciate the time all of you are giving us this Sunday.